I quickly checked in with the phantom Terry Pratchett on my shoulder.
They didn't want me freaking out.
It is a little bit like giving up your baby to be adopted.
Hello and welcome to the Waterstones podcast. I'm Will Rycroft, and in this week's episode we're going to be talking about adaptation. The only thing Hollywood loves more than a risk-averse remake is to scour the bookshelves for material to transfer to the silver screen. But adaptation means more than just the movies, and in this podcast we'll be hearing from Margaret Atwood on how her 1984 novel The Handmaid's Tale became one of the most talked about TV series of recent years. We'll hear from Neil Gaiman about the art of adaptation and the differences between seeing his books move to screens, large and small, and even onto the theatrical stage. And we're joined in the studio by RJ Palacio, author of Wonder, a global bestseller that was recently adapted and filmed by podcast alumnus Stephen Chbosky. Her latest book, White Bird, draws on her skills as a graphic designer and develops characters from the world of Wonder. It is a great pleasure to have you here, RJ. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to have you here. As I mentioned, Stephen Chbosky has been a guest on this very podcast. We will get to him later.
Yes.
But I'm also joined by Holly. How are you, Holly?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you. Very well. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Would I be right in thinking that your favourite adaptation involves the songs of ABBA?
I think you could be correct, yes. But I must actually say that this is the most excited that I have been to record an episode today. I am like the biggest fan of Wonder.
Oh my goodness, wow.
Like, that's massive fangirl. I'm really sorry.
Thank you. No, I love it. Thank you so much.
I'm now going to leave the room and leave you to just
to cry.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about Wonder, because that book, obviously, huge bestseller, beloved of so many readers. When you published it, did you have any indication that it was going to sort of fly like that, or how did that happen?
No. The answer to that really is no. I mean, even when I was writing it, I don't know if you know this, but I worked in book publishing for the 25 years prior to even starting to write it. And so I knew a lot about book publishing, and I know that, you know, my advice to my authors had always been don't quit your day job, because it's really hard to get a book to sort of lift off the ground and sell. So we publish a lot of great books, and I'm in Waterstones right now. Thousands of books that are fantastic get published every year, and they fail to find a readership. So it's really hard to write a book that connects with a wide readership. We still do it anyway. And so when I was writing Wonder, I honestly didn't think that it would sell beyond, maybe my friends and family at a discount, maybe. But it wasn't, the books that were in a middle grade and YA at the time that were selling, that were really popular at the time I was writing Wonder, and at the time Wonder came out, were, all had vampires in them, or dystopian fiction. That was the big hot, ticket. So my little book about a little boy with a, not an ordinary face kind of thing didn't seem like it would be a ticket to bestsellerdom at all. So, there was no indication that it would be a big book at all.
Holly, as a reader and lover of that book, what is it about it that you loved so much as a reader?
I think for me it's the fact that you can read it so many times over and find new things that you love in it each time. It's probably my most thumbed book on my bookshelf, for sure. It's just absolutely perfect.
You've actually brought your copy in, haven't you?
One of them.
Important to have multiple copies of your favourite books.
It's wonderful also seeing when people come to my signings and they bring their well-read books that are in tatters and multiple notations and underlined and stuff. Those are my favourite types of things to sign.
Oh, it's adorable. Yeah. And actually, Stephen actually said the same thing, that he obviously has people coming up to him with copies of The Perks of Being a Wallflower. And as you say, similarly, there are notes in there, the pages have been sort of turned many, many times, and it's clearly a cherished item.
Yeah.
There's something that I think, again, the physical books, this is one of the things they can do, is that copy becomes so important to you, no matter how battered and bruised it is.
Absolutely.
I find that actually, if I look on my bookshelves now, the books that I retain and have kept for many years are the ones from many, many years ago, because they have a sentimental value, whereas the ones I've read more recently I tend to read and then have to discard because I can't keep them all.
I completely agree with that.
Isn't
yes,
that
yeah.
Let's talk about that adaptation though. So We've heard Stephen's side of the story. Let's hear your side of the story.
Oh no, I should have listened to his side just to be on the same page. The producers approached me and they asked if I wanted to have my book adapted by them, and I was a little tentative at first because it is a little bit like giving up your baby to be adopted by someone else and raised, and you just have to really trust that they have the same vision for it that you do. And I had met with other producers prior to that, and I did not trust that they would do the job that I wanted. But the two producers that I ended up sort of throwing my hat in with, they were like fantastic, and every step of the way they were really, it was about trying to represent the book as well as they could, with as much integrity and building on the theme of kindness. They were really intent on doing that from the very beginning.
Do you have to, as you say, that you're sort of handing over your child to these people, and there's an element of involvement which is sort of, I suppose, decided on by many factors, like, are you a producer on it, or are you just simply a writer, or do you just literally hand over your idea and see what somebody else does? For you, did you have to just kind of hand it over and trust that they would respect, I suppose, the material?
Yeah, well, when the book was first optioned, Wonder had just come out. So at the time, I was just, can you imagine, you write your first novel, and then they tell you they want to make a movie, and you're like, okay, tell me where to sign, and you sign away everything. Then afterwards, it took a while for them to be able to bring the book to screen, because it was very challenging for them for a lot of reasons. But by the time they were going into production, sort of the value of the book had gone up in terms of it had become a bestseller, and it was now in 55 languages around the world, and suddenly I had a little bit more, as an author, a little bit more capital, let's say. I don't know if it was because of that, or just out of the goodness of their hearts, but the producers really wanted me to be involved as much as possible. So they consulted with me a lot about the things that they could. In general, there was a lot of consulting with me after decisions had been made. They would tell me what the decisions were, and then I was given the opportunity on a couple of occasions, if I really strongly disagreed with some vision that they had, I was allowed to weigh in, and in fact they did respect that. But I had to be careful. I had to choose where to sort of really draw the line, because you can't do that all the time. I certainly, and it's weird because if you're the author of kindness, people have this expectation that you're going to be like super kind. So like you have to walk on eggshells all the time, because it's not always that easy to be kind. It's hard. You choose kind, and if someone is doing something, having to do with your book that you really feel strongly is not, oh my goodness, please don't do that. You have to figure out a very kind way to say it, but it still is paid attention to. But I think I managed to do that where it mattered, and overall I didn't have to do it that much because they really did have a really wonderful vision for their take. And then they hired Stephen, who was so, he loved the book so much, and he just wanted to do right by it.
That is, I think, pretty much exactly what he said, right?
Yeah, but on the flip side.
Yeah, and
it's
I think,
amazing.
I wonder whether, because obviously he's a filmmaker and an author, whether there was a certain, I guess you could relax a little in that he understands the difference between those two things, and also like how to transfer one form to the other.
He did, and he was a great teacher for me, because there was a lot of things that I came to understand because of the way he explained it to me.
With your new book, White Bird, that is connected to the world of Wonder. Would you like to just tell us how it's connected?
It's a very tangential connection. In Wonder, if you'll remember, there's the bully, Julian. And Julian gets a chance to somewhat redeem himself in a book that I followed up Wonder with, which is called Augie and Me. Julian has his own chapter, and he's able to tell a little bit of his story. So we get to not completely exculpate him of sort of his he's a a nasty kid in Wonder. So he doesn't really redeem himself, but we do come to understand him a little bit more and understand why he was behaving the way he was, which I think is really important with bullies. I think it's really important to sort of get to the root of what's going on with them. So the Julian chapter explored that story. In the course of the Julian chapter, it's only Julian's grandmother, because remember, his parents are kind of clueless and don't help much at all. But his grandmother sort of catches on to the idea that her grandson is going through a hard time and needs a little bit, of guidance. And so she decides to share with him a story that she actually has never revealed to anybody before about her time growing up as a young Jewish girl in Nazi-occupied France. And in the Julian chapter, the story is 2 or 3 pages long. And after that came out, I started hearing from a lot of educators saying, thank you for that. That was the perfect introduction to the themes of the Holocaust for my, 10 and 11-year-olds. Given the times we're in right now, I just thought maybe now was a good time for me to take her story and tell it in a more complete and bigger way. And
you've chosen to tell it in the form of a graphic novel, as I said, drawing on your skills as a graphic designer. But why a graphic novel rather than a novel?
I think because this podcast is about this, I honestly envisioned it as a movie in a lot of ways. Right. And when I was first telling the story, when I was first sort of writing the story out, it kind of came to me as a movie, and I started sketching it out as I was writing it, in a very cinematic way. I mean, and because really a graphic novel in a lot of ways is basically a storyboard, and you get to decide a lot of things that maybe the director would decide. Like, is this going to be a 1-shot or a 2-shot? Is this going to be a close-up? Do I pull back here to reveal the entire scene? But you're also a lighting designer, you're also the prop master, because you're deciding what's going to go in the background. So you're the cinematographer, the lighting designer, you're the costume designer, you're the prop designer. You sort of are really staging this entire movie. The only thing you're not doing is providing music. So basically, but the rest of it is very much like a movie that you get to, the movie that's in your head that you get to kind of tell. And because my background was in illustration, I could do it. So it was kind of fun.
We're going to hear now from the first of our authors that we're going to listen to. Neil Gaiman is an author who has adapted many of his own works for other mediums. Good Omens recently on the TV, The Ocean at the End of the Lane at the National Theatre, and the marvellous Coraline, of course, on cinema screens. Now, as one of the most eloquent writers about the process of writing, it will come as no surprise to you that he has some fascinating things to say about the art of adaptation. I began by asking him about the first work of his to be turned into something new. The first work of mine that
was adapted from one form into another actually taught me almost all of the lessons that I've learned about adaptation. And it was a graphic novel called Violent Cases, and it was turned into a dramatic onstage monologue. And what I learned from that is you cannot simply put one medium into another medium. Moments which in the graphic novel were powerful and slow and awful became offhanded lines when just said by somebody on stage. Moments in the book that were not actually incredibly important because they had a little bit of theatrical magic, even with just lighting on the stage, became enormously important. So it turned from a hard-edged graphic novel about memory and murder and gangsters and the continuous violence of an adult world into something sort of soft and rosy about the magic of memory, where mostly what you're left with was the feeling of, I'm not really sure why somebody told me that story. And I remember watching it in the audience on the first night and thinking, it's so accurate. I can mouth along, I know all of the words, but it isn't my thing anymore. And I thought, you have to look at what the medium is that you're translating something into, and then you have to make it a thing for that. If you simply if you think you've simply moved something from one medium to another, you will have failed. You have to translate. It's like language. And that was incredibly useful. For me, the stage experience is peculiar because one thing that you realize very quickly is that each night's performance is a thing that happened and will never happen again. And that's not true in a book. You have a book, the words will be the same. At least in theory, the experience will be the same the next time you go back. The experience of watching an episode of Good Omens is going to be the same the next time you go back. But seeing different ways that Coraline has been put on stage, I remember working with the National Theatre of Scotland to put The Wolves and the Walls on the stage. And my favourite ever production was, I think, the second preview that we did. And it was also the scariest. And from that day on, we started dialing back the scary quotient. I think mostly because we were scared of little puddles of urine under the seats as these kids watched it. But I always felt like it was never quite that good again. The willingness just to be terrifying and our desire to make it cozier somehow worked against the material. I'm trying to think if there's anything of mine that I've literally walked away from, and I don't think there is. I think all of the adaptations of mine, to some extent or other, I have been involved in. I've been a producer, I've been active. I remember with Stardust, finding Jane Goldman, who had never written a script before, for Matthew Vaughn, and saying, I want Jane to be the writer, and sitting and doing, Jane and I playing all parts between us, reading her first draft of the script to Matthew, and working on that, and even giving them things like the ending, saying, okay, well, the ending, of the book will not work as a film. So let me give you this. My suggestion will be doing a sort of what do stars do, they shine, and letting that happen. So that for me, it was something I was very, very involved in. With Coraline, I was less involved. My biggest involvement was Henry Selick sent me the first draft of his script, and I read it, and my notes to Henry were, Henry, this is exactly like the book, but it's not a script. It was that thing that I was talking about earlier of you can't simply take something from one medium and make it something else. You have to make it something else in order for it to work. And I said, all the stuff that works really well in the book of her walking around thinking is going to be really kind of dull. You have to make this yours. Do whatever you need to make it yours. If you need to set it in America, set it in America. If you need to bring in more characters, bring in more characters. Just make it your thing. And it took him a year. And then he sent me the script for Coraline, and I said, this is great. This feels like a film. And from then on, my advice and input was minimal. Coraline, for me, was my favorite. Just watching what Henry Selick did and looking at it and going, this too is art. There's nothing about this I would change, really. Maybe a couple of moments toward the end. But I think you've made something perfect, or practically perfect in every way. And that, I think, for me, was huge. I guess the weird thing is, though, you're always doing the equivalent. of sending your child off to school, knowing that you won't see them again for a year, and hoping that they're still recognizable to you as your kid. Which I guess is why I decided that I had to make Good Omens myself. I made it because Terry Pratchett asked me to make it. And I'd, by that point, written enough scripts myself to know that you can have a fantastic script, but what appears on the screen is not necessarily going to be fantastic. It depends to what extent you get the thing that you wrote and the thing that was in your head onto the screen. And if you do not have the power to get those things onto the screen, then it really is all up to the gods. So for me, I actually made myself showrunner only so that I could cast the people that I wanted to cast, so that I could make sure that when producers came up to me and said, okay, we have to save 1.2 million, so we're going to cut this scene, and this scene, I could say, if you cut those scenes, nothing is going to make sense. However, you can cut this scene and this scene and this scene with impunity, and you will not damage the fabric of the thing. Because producers don't look at what makes sense or not. They look at what's easy to cut. If you cut this scene, you've saved yourself a day's filming. That's great. And you go, yes, but that actually, if you don't have that scene, nothing that you've done before or after will work. And then people will say, wonder why, this stuff gets made where you can tell the writer doesn't even care. It doesn't make any sense. You go, it made sense in the script. Damn you.
Did you feel, I suppose, as well, a certain responsibility for doing it for Terry?
I felt an entire responsibility doing it for Terry. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. Giving up 3 years of your life to make 6 hours of television at BBC rates, when you could be writing best-selling novels instead, it's not really, there's no financial incentive. There's not really even artistic incentive. You're still making art if you're writing the books. But my friend asked me to. And when I accepted that, it also meant that I was accepting everything that came with that. And if I'm going to do it, then I'm going to do it properly. And I'm going to make the thing. There was a point where some of our producers decided that they needed to save money by losing Terry's favourite scene that he had brought to Good Omens, the death of Agnes Nutter. And I quickly checked in with the phantom Terry Pratchett on my shoulder, listened to everything he said, and then explained to them much more politely that was not going to happen.
RJ, you, in fact, and I and Holly were all sat here nodding our heads, and it was like you thought, yeah, recognise that. Did that chime a lot with you?
Absolutely. So much of what he said, just and again, just remembering that I have 1/100th of the experience that he does with adaptations, or just hearing him sort of list all the many versions and the many adaptations he's had of his many works, and I really speak from just my one limited focal point, which was wonder, but so much of what he said rang true. It's interesting though. So for my next project, I decided I didn't really want to be the screenwriter, because in essence, what I did learn from Wonder is that the first screenplay, it changes tremendously. Really, what's most important is to be able to be in a position where you have input after the screenplay is written, and certainly have a lot of input in terms of the final script, the shooting script, usually the third draft. And that's what I learned from Wonder. So I realized that it doesn't quite matter as much. So long as you get a great first screenplay in the works, but the details of it and the nuances is something that, as a producer, you actually do have some input on. And certainly, I think a director has the most input ultimately in what Neil said, in envisioning the final scenes.
Interesting as well that you both saw your works as children.
I know, except mine was much worse. Like, I give them away. He just gives them away for a year. Maybe, I don't know what that says about us, but yeah.
I suppose it was more to do with your involvement with Wonder was to hand it over, wasn't it?
It was. Yes, he gets it back, I guess. Yeah. Almost unrecognizable. But yeah, I did hand mine over completely, and with a lot of trust and faith.
You have to, yeah. And it's interesting as well that the different mediums that he's worked in, completely different. TV is different to film, is different to stage, and they're completely different disciplines. But I suppose the unifying thing for him all of the time, and I suppose it's with all of his work, is that he's only interested in making good art,
right?
And that's always the most important thing. It must be the same for you.
It is, and also the idea of translating one medium to another, and knowing and understanding and letting go of sort of your ego in terms of your work, and understanding that it's not some sort of sacred text that can't be changed or modified to fit a different medium, and understanding that what might work, on the written page has to again take flight in a totally different format and in a visual medium. And for me, it's always been, I think, maybe a little easier than a lot of my other author friends who maybe don't have a graphic design background or an illustration or an art background, because the words is how the words are their canvas and there are their movies. That's how they express themselves. And so when they've seen changes to their written words, they might take it a little bit more to heart. With me, I maybe because of my art background, I completely get that it has to be tweaked and modified so that it's a good translation. Translation was the perfect word. It's a good translation of your work from one medium to another. So it makes a lot of sense.
It's the perfect word, I think.
Yeah.
Of course, some pieces of work aren't adapted just the once. They can be adapted many times in a person's lifetime, and that's indeed the case for our next author. One of the most striking adaptations, I think, of recent times has been the TV adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. It was a programme that had inspired, I think, plenty of water cooler conversation, lots of debate, and in fact, we've seen on the news the very familiar red-clad figures of those handmaids making appearances at political demonstrations become a sort of, an activism figure, really. And as you were talking about what's happening in the United States at the moment, they've appeared many times, haven't
Absolutely.
they? So it's sort of become a much bigger thing, I suppose, than the novel was initially. But of course, it had previously been turned into a film. After her Booker Prize win for the sequel, The Testaments, it was a real privilege to be able to speak to Margaret Atwood about why those books resonate so much today, and also, of course, about her own literary adaptations.
So the TV rights went with the original film rights back in 1989-90. And then people lost track of who actually had that contract. So for a while, nobody really knew, and people were saying, can we do this? And I would say, I don't know who has the rights. But it was eventually discovered that it was MGM. So by that time, it wasn't me letting it go. That had already happened. It was the idea of somebody else is now going to make it. And they tried an original pilot script, which was not going to work. And then they went to Hulu, which was at that time fairly far down the ladder of web streaming companies, and was just rated by USA Today as #1. So they made it very big with The Handmaid's Tale. They gambled all their chips. They pulled it off. They produced a quality show, lucky me. So when it's a quality show, it has an impact. If it isn't, it just goes into the, millions of appeared, disappeared sorts of things, and there are a lot of those. So they did it very well, and the star, Elizabeth Moss, is also a producer on it, so I think that had an effect as well.
Such a crucial part in the story,
Oh,
and
she
to
has
have
to
her,
carry, and she's an amazing close-up face actress. So just the slightest twitch changes the meaning of everything, and because it was such a, especially in season 1, which followed the book pretty closely, it was an inner monologue played against the outward action. So a person who has to keep quite restrained but is seething within, she enacted that very well, and it did help that they allowed some voiceover. The film that they did in '89 was written with voiceover, but the director took it out.
Right.
He was in his minimalist phase.
It does make a huge difference, doesn't it? Because
it does, because you don't have to, if you're playing against your own voiceover, you don't have to sort of contort your face unduly.
Yeah, but too much face acting.
No.
I mean, when you saw Rushes coming back from the TV adaptation, did you think immediately, yes, this is going to work?
I saw the first episode. They wouldn't actually let me see it until they'd cut it and put in the sound.
Yeah.
They didn't want me freaking out, so that they wanted me to see it at its best.
Yeah.
But I had read the scripts and made notes on them. So I have influence but no power. I can say what I think.
Yeah.
It will be listened to. It won't not necessarily be done. But we haven't had any huge fights.
That's good. And obviously a huge difference with seasons 2 and onwards with the sort of story diverting away from your source material.
It became more like a TV show, so they have to have action. And a TV show has to have action.
Yeah.
It has to have a cliffhanger at the end of every episode. It's a lot more like Charles Dickens than it is like, say, Samuel Beckett.
And as well as being adapted, you have done some adaptation yourself, I suppose, in a way, with the novel Hag-seed, which was taking inspiration from Shakespeare and creating something new with it. I wonder what you felt like at the outset of writing that book. Is there something slightly daunting about creating something new from Shakespeare, or did you just feel invigorated?
Of course it's daunting, but it's also invigorating, and it was Becky, who was the editor on the Testaments, who proposed this. Mm-hmm. And luckily she proposed it to me quite early on, because it was a whole project. About 9 writers took it on, and the brief was pick a play of Shakespeare's and write a modern novel. So she asked me quite early on, therefore I had the pick of all of them. And I said, I want to do The Tempest. If I can't do The Tempest, I don't want to do anyone at all. So I got to do the one that I wanted to do. It's the play that comes the closest to Shakespeare showing us what it was that he actually did.
Right. Because
Prospero is a writer, director, producer of his own play. He's directing them, and he's unseen. He's usually unseen behind the scenes. And he has a special effects guy that helps him make it happen, and that would be Ariel. He couldn't do it without Ariel. So I was very interested in that conjunction of the creative process with the thing created, which is what one of the things that The Tempest is. And also it's a play that is more understood. It's understood better by older people than by younger people.
Of course, written right at the end of his life as well.
Yeah, so, well, that's what people think, but it wasn't maybe his very last thing that he did, but we like to think it was, because it fits so well.
It fits the narrative.
Yeah, so Romeo and Juliet is understood better by younger people.
Yeah.
As long as it's played the age the characters actually are. If you play them as 20-year-olds, you think these people are crazy. But if you play them as 14, 16, around that age, you think, right, they're teenagers.
Yeah, of course they're behaving like that.
I'm going to kill myself.
We've all been there. You can have influence and no power. You were nodding your head at that point, RJ.
I was thinking exactly that. Okay, so that's how I should have articulated it before. It's power without influence, and this time I want some power with influence. Beautifully said, Margaret Atwood. Thank you. And it's also so interesting. I'm such a huge fan of the show, as I was also Game of Thrones. And to me, it's interesting, having been a big fan of the show, to see what happens when the showrunners and the producers start start, they take on the story without the book as sort of the Bible, and how it can go this way or that without sort of that, storytellers tell stories. And I think the lesson in both, because, with Game of Thrones, obviously, not obviously, but I wasn't a huge fan of the last season. And I think one of the reasons really is that they might have followed sort of the overarching plot points that J.R.R. Martin might have had, but, they didn't have the book. And with The Handmaid's Tale as well, that first season was so strong, and I think it says a lot about the power of the author.
It does. It seems to me that there's the detail. You can have those plot points, which is presumably what they had towards the end of Game of Thrones, but if you don't have the detail, which is clearly what makes those books so successful, it doesn't quite work. It feels a little bit like it's a balloon that's come untethered, and you just can't quite grab a hold of the string again.
Yeah, it's characters and plot lines certainly lose their meaning, and they become untethered. I think there's an old saying, God is in the details, and it's really true when it comes to writing and good writing.
I've heard the devil is in the details.
Oh, so. God, the devil depends on what your perspective is. Yes, I don't know.
But what we do know is the writer is damn important.
Damn important, yes.
RJ, it's been such a pleasure to speak to you.
It's been great
about
talking
Wonder,
to you. Thank you.
And we obviously wish you all the best for Whitebird. We will look forward to seeing that on a big screen at some point, but in the meantime, we have your excellent graphic novel to read.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful talking to both of you. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
To play us out, we're going to hear our booksellers' recommendations, but before that, there's just time to let you know that our next episode finds good things in small packages, as we tackle short stories with Naomi Ishiguro, Zadie Smith, and Julia Armfield. See you then.
Hi, I'm Nick Walden from Waterstones Piccadilly. The book I'd like to recommend on the theme of adaptation is This Thing of Darkness by Harry Thompson, which is a fictionalised account of the friendship between Charles Darwin and Captain Fitzroy. And as Darwin discovers his theory of evolution, we find how a scientific discovery can blow a human relationship to pieces. It's one of my top favourite books.
Hi, this is Katrina from Glasgow, and for the theme adaptation I'm recommending Astronaut Chris Hadfield's biography, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. In it he talks about how he adapts to life in the International Space Station, which kind of sounds impossible, but Hadfield writes with such passion about his time there and his journey to life in space, and it's both thrilling and inspiring.
Hi, I'm Martha from Waterstones, and the book I'd like to recommend on the theme of adaptation is the wonderful short story collection Not the End of the World by Kate Atkinson. Packed full of weird bodily transformations, strange meetings and unexpected forks in the road, it's just a completely wild ride.